Hi guys, welcome back to channel. Today we are going to learn this things called RE framework, that is things called in UiPath. So if you go for any interview in a crossword, people are going to ask this things called what is RE framework in UiPath. We are going to understand here. Okay. So there are a number of questions like that in different like that. If you go for interview, there were lots of questions in their mind like that. What is RE framework? How to create the RE framework, and what are the components of RE framework? So these things we are going to discuss more about these things called difference between state machine and RE framework, and what is config file in RE framework. This parts we are going to discuss today. So the first question right now is what is RE framework? The first part, this is the things called what is RE framework, and that things today we are going to learn here. Okay. So RE stand for, you have to go for this things called RE stand for robotic enterprise framework. Okay. So that is the things we have to go for learn right now. Robotic enterprise framework is entirely based on state machine. If you are going to learn this things called state machine, first we have to learn this things called what is state machine and how we can create the particular program in state machine. We have already learned these things called state machine, and that things you have to understand, and that is things called entire flow state machine. We have three states and one fine state, that is things called one is states, and the one part is this thing called end states. We have three states and one states, and they are the sub process modules and mini process. RE framework is a transactional business process that follow the best practice for large scale deployment. So that is things called RE framework. So RE framework is the one particular template, that is one particular framework where we can create the program that is not for the normal small program. That is if you're going for these things called multiple conditional, or if you're going for these things called any type of logical program, there you can go for these things called start the program using these things called RE framework. Let me come to the previous slide. The question right now is how to create the RE framework program. That things we are going to learn right now. So the first part, if you're going for this things called RE framework program or any UiPath program, first you have to install this things called UiPath Studio. And when you try to go for this thing called UiPath Studio, you have to create any new project. You know that how to create these things called new project. We have to go for this thing called process, and there I can pass this things called fab data. That is things called one project name. That is things called fab data. Right now we are going to create the particular project. Okay, so right now we are getting these things called fab data, and here we have to go for this things called main.xml file. That is things called main.xml file. In every particular program, we'll get these things called main.xml file, and main.xml file that is especially for unattended bot. Okay, so in any project, if you want to create the new program, you have to go for these things called new. And when you go for these things called new, we are getting these things called sequence, flowchart, and state machine. You know all these things why we're going for these things called sequence, flowchart, and state machine. Sequence especially for a small program, that is especially for sequence of program, like that linear program, that is for line by line program. Flowchart especially for a small program as well as large program, you can go for that. And the state machine, if you're going for any conditional program, there you can go for these things called state machine. Okay, let me come to this things called the third last slide. The entire flow is this things called state machine. Means in RE framework, if you're going for learn this things called state machine, sorry, RE framework, you have to first focus on this things called state machine. What is state machine? How to create the state machine? That things already we have learned. So we'll go for this things called in RE framework, and I will tell you about this things called what is state machine, all these things. Okay. So here in UiPath, if you want to create the state machine program, I will give you these things called little bit introductions. You can go for these things called state machine, guys. And there I'm giving the same name, that is things called state machine. And there you can create the same thing like that. If you're going for create the sequence program, you can take these things called sequence, and we can pass your sequence. If you want to create these things called flowchart, you can create these things called flowchart, and you can pass all these things. Okay. But what is the difference between all these things? Sequence, flowchart, state machine. Sequence, we are not getting the start. That is especially for one small program. Flowchart especially for small as well as large program, and state machine especially for conditional and logical program. But right now in state machine, you cannot take any activity like that close window, close tab, delete, nothing. Okay, we cannot take any activity. If you go for sequence, we can take all activity. We can take all the activity. In flowchart, if you come also, you can take all the activity. We can pass here any activity, application, scope, all these things we can pass. But in state machine, the question right now is we cannot pass any activity. So which activity we have to pass? State machine, its name is clear. Only we can pass the state machine. And here, if you're going to pass this things called state machine, so there we are getting these things called final state and state. So only this particular child activity we can pass in this things called state machine, guys. Okay, start. If you go for flowchart also, we can move these things called start. We can keep anywhere. That is things called start. If you come to state machine also, you can keep anywhere. That is things called start. We can keep like that anywhere. Okay, so here we can change this particular things model, and in this things, in this particular state machine, we can enlarge the particular activity, and we can connect like this way, and we can connect like this way, and we can go for that. Okay, so that is things called state machine here, guys. And here we can take n number of state. We can take n number of state, but at least you have to keep final state at least one. Okay, so if you want to close the program, if you're going to end the program, at least one state machine, sorry, final state you have to take. Final state means I'm talking about this part. Okay, so final state we can take here. Okay, so before going to learn, if you are going to start this things called ReframeWork, you have to go for this things called learn the particular things, that is things called state part. You have to learn this things called how the states is going to do and how we can connect these particular things. You have to understand the particular things. Okay, so that is things called state machine program, and we can connect the final state. Right now will not get any type of error. Okay, so that is things called state machine program, and that box's name is called, that is a child activity of state machine. That is things called state, and that is things called final state. And this state machine program is especially for if you have multiple logics, multiple conditions, then we can go for this things called state machine program. Okay. Right now, today agenda is not state machine. Right now, today agenda is this things called RE framework. And for RE framework, we are going for this things called UiPath. And here we are going to launch the UiPath Studio again. And there we are going to create the RE framework program. But before RE framework program, you have to understand about this things called state machine. Like this way, we can create the state machine program and we can connect like that. So minimum, at least you have to keep the one states and one final state. Final state, you have to keep only one because we cannot take more than one. But state, if you want to take 1, 2, 3, 4, infinite, you can take these things called state machine. But final state, you have to keep only one. Okay, so that is things called, we have already connected, and all this activity we can enlarge like this way. That is the part of statement. That is the advantage of ReframeWork, that we can create the box and we can go for enlarge. Let me come this things called RE framework. For RE framework, you have to click here. That is things called robotic enterprise framework, and that is especially for create a transactional business process that follow the best practice for large scale deployments. Okay, the same things I've written here also. RE framework is the transactional business process that follow the best practices for large scale deployment, and that things we are going to learn here. Okay, so let me come here, guys, and here if you come to RE framework, you have to click on this things called robotic enterprise framework. If you go for lots of interview, they can ask these things called what is the full form of RE. RE means, RE stand for robotic enterprise framework. Right now we are getting this thing called robotic enterprise framework 8 we are getting here because in previous we have already get these things called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to 7, 8. Today is this things called 8. If you want to change the name, if you want to change these things called RE framework FAB. Okay, so if you want to check these things, we can pass here right now. That is things called RE framework FAB program, and we can create like this way. Okay, we can create like this way, and the same thing, whatever you get in any project, creating the workspace, adding the dependency, the same thing you will also get in RE framework. But there are a number of things you have to understand in RE framework. The things right now in this previous project, we got like that main. And we in every project try to start with these things called main. If you click here main, we are getting nothing in this project. But if you come to RE framework, you have to start these things using these things called main. And whenever you're going to click on this things called main, and if you're going to click on this main, automatically you will get one framework. And that framework in every particular project, if you're going to create the, if you're new, if you're a beginners, automatically you will get this type of framework, and that is built by UiPath. product-based company, and right now automatically you will get these things called this type of framework. You don't have to worry for all these things like that. You don't have to create automatically like that. Each and everything you will get the by default. Okay, that things we are going to understand here. Okay, so here if you come to slide, we are getting this question right now. What is RE framework? We have understand these things. That is the one template. That is one framework for creating any type of project. How to create the RE framework? That things also done right now. We have created. We have started using these things called UiPath Studio. What are the components of RE framework? That things we are going to understand here. Okay, so if you go for any program, any interview across world, people can ask you what are the components of RE framework. Okay, so when you come to RE framework, the components is right now that is in front of you. That is things called initialization. That is things called get transaction. That is called process transaction, and that is things called end process. Okay, so right now whatever the box we are getting these things called, that is one, that is things called, it's called state. The same thing we have created earlier in this things in this particular program, that is the state machine program. But if you come to state machine, everything is blank. Everything right now we are getting here blank, and the by default name is this thing called state. By default, that name is called state. But when you come to RE framework program, that we are getting this things called initialization, and whatever the initialization, that is the by default name. If you go for any interview, you don't have to say right now that is things called state. State is this things called one activity, but they have renamed this things called as a initialization. So right now, if you're going to ask, if anyone is going to ask these things, what are the components of RE framework, that components name is called initialization, get transaction, process transaction, and your end process. Look, so this particular activity, that is same like that whatever we have created earlier, that is things called state. And right now if you want to rename this part also, you can pass like this way. That is things called initialization, and that is also you can go for enlarge. Whatever you want to go for that, you can enlarge like this way. We can go for that enlarge. Okay, and same thing if you come to this things called RE framework, that we are getting this things called initialization. Again, the question right now is what is read configuration file and how we are getting like this type of data. So this data also you can create in this particular program. You can come to this and you can paste here. That is things called annotation. It's called annotation, and there you can pass here. That is also we have done. That we can go for click on pin, and the same thing we are getting here. So whatever the particular RE framework program, here if you want to copy, you can go there and you can paste there. Okay, so we can come here and we can go for this things called annotation, and we can go for this things called add annotation option, and there you can paste. You can click on pin. Right now we're getting the same thing. Okay, so that things we can copy, get transaction data, that if we go to go for this things called rename, and we can go for there and we can paste into this particular place. We can go for rename and we can paste. Okay, so that things here, that is the things called process transaction. We can go for copy and we can go for paste. Okay, so that is the RE framework is totally based on these things called state machine. So before going to RE framework, you have to understand these things called what is the particular things called state machine. And here we can go for these things called annotation, and there we can go for these things called your add annotation, and there you can pass this particular place, and like this way we can create. And here okay, so let me go for that. I'll try to show these things. Okay, so like this way we can create. Okay, so next question, maybe you can ask this thing. So what is the difference between that part? Okay, so please understand, guys, you have to understand this part also again. So let me complete this work. So I will try to tell you this part. Okay, so that is called end process, and here we can copy this part. Okay, so that is the things called here, that is things called state machine, and I have given the shape of these things called RE framework. That is not one any RE framework program. That is things called, you have to understand, guys. But here, what I'm trying to say right now, that here that is things called RE framework program, but RE framework program is totally dependent on this things called your particular program, that is things called state machine, guys. Okay, so here I'm going to share one particular documentation. So I'm going to write here two types of framework, that is things called standard, and one is this things called custom. Standard means here whatever the RE framework, this particular program we have created, that is things called one RE framework, that name is called Robotic Enterprise Framework February program. But again, this next part is this things called custom framework. What is custom framework? Custom framework means whatever the basic things, whatever the basic state machine you are going to create, that is things called custom framework. Custom framework means here you have to create the state part. You can take 1 2 3 4, whatever you want to go for that. Multiple states you can take here, and after that you can take this things called what you can say final state from this things called activity, that is things called final state. After that you have to go for this things called renaming this part. After that you're going for this things called providing the annotation. After that you're going to pass the any activity in state machine. Here inside that we can pass any activity, whatever the activity you want to pass here, we can pass here in this particular place. Okay, so that is the things, guys. If you're going to create any custom framework means you have to take all this activity and you have to pass this data, and you can pass these things called try catch block, exception handling, each and everything you have to pass. That is things called custom framework. In market 100%, 90% company go for these things called this particular standard framework that is given by UiPath, and whatever the custom framework you are creating, that is created by yourself. Okay, so you can create this type of custom framework, and depend on requirement you can go for that. A number of company like KPMG or your Optum, that there are a number of company they create this type of custom framework. But for custom framework, it's not simple, it's not easy. For creating it can take more than 1 month, 2 months also time, because they can pass their own way. Maybe the client also they can recommend these things called please create the custom framework like that, and there are a number of config file and lots of things they are going to change depend on requirement. So right now I will go for recommend this things called go for this things called standard framework. But before going to start this things called standard framework, you have to go for state machine. So that's why I have given this things called example, that things we are going to understand here right now. So again, right now come to this things called RE framework, that things we have understand right now, that is the standard framework UiPath, and it's clear right now like that RE framework, that is things called Robotic Enterprise Framework. And here RE framework is entirely based on the state machine, entirely flow is called state machine, that is things called 3 states and 1 final state. It's called sub process, sub modules, and mini process. Okay, so that is things called, guys, state machine program. So right now we're getting this things called each state has some input transition and output transition, that is things called you have to understand, and it has multiple inputs and multiple output transition. This word, this sentence you have to understand. Let me come here, guys. So when you come to this things called simple state machine program, like that whatever you have created in front of you, here it's called in state machine. Whenever you learn in very detailed level, in very depth level, it's called transition. Right side we are getting this thing is called transition, that is called T1. Okay, let me show you. So when you go for in very like that, I'll try to show this part. When you like that, okay, so here I am getting this things called T1, T2, T3, that is called transition. The same thing here if you come to RE framework also, that same thing we are getting here, that is things called, it's called transition. It's called transition. Every transition is connected, means that is the way we can connect from one particular activity to another activity, and that we can go for connect. Okay, so same thing I've written here, each states and sub input file transition, output transition, and it has multiple inputs and multiple output transition, but each transition has some condition and unique condition, either system exception or success. Okay, so that things we are going to understand right now is here. Let me come to this things called full-fledged in RE framework. Okay, so right now let me come here, guys. In RE framework, we have 4 components. The first one is this things called initialization, get transaction, process transaction, and final one is this things called end process. But here you have to focus, the main part is things called activity. This activity is called state. This activity is called state. Right now you can see this symbol, that is the activity, that is things called state. But right now in every particular RE framework or state machine, any program, custom framework, your standard framework, any framework, final state should be only one. Final state should be only one. That is things called symbol of final state. Right now you can see here, and right now they have changed the name. Okay, so in ReframeWork also we have 3 states: one for initialization, second for get transaction, and third for the process transaction. Okay, let me understand all these things in very depth level. We are going for these things called very depth level. So the last question about these things called what are the components of RFM, that is also clear. That is things called initialization, get transaction, process, and your final state. That things we are learned here. That is the things called components. Let me go for this things on next question. What is the difference between state machine and RFM? You also guys got what is state machine. When you are going to create any new program, you go for this things called in particular project, you go for this things called new, and you create the any state machine program. It's called state machine program, but in real it's one, you are going to create one custom framework also. Whatever the new program you create state machine program, that is called custom framework, because you can create the lots of things in this things called state machine program. In UiPath, that is the toughest program, so that's also it's called custom framework, and that is things called state machine program. So that things you can create the state machine. But in state machine program, if you're getting all these things in proper way, like the exception handling, like your renaming part, like your like that your annotations, like your renaming part, each and everything, if you want in proper way, in proper one framework, then you can go for these things called RFM. That is the difference between state machine and RFM. If you're going to create any state machine program, there you have to inbuild all these things. You have to go for rename, you have to go for add the transition, you have to add these things called annotation, you have to add all these things, and even this particular transition also you have to add. Means this particular transition also you have to add, otherwise you will get the error. But when you come to RFM, you don't have to worry for this type of transition and this type of things. You don't have to worry. So that is the answer of this particular question, the difference between state machine and your ReframeWork. Okay, the next question right now is what is config file in ReframeWork? Okay, before going to understand this part, let me go for ReframeWork and let me understand these things in very depth level. Each and every component right now we are going to understand. That is theoretical part. Right now we are going to understand. Okay, so that is the name is called, every particular word you have to understand, man. Every particular word, the word is called initialization. What is initialization? Initialization means you are going to initialize any application, whatever. If you're going to automate the web-based application, you're going to automate the desktop, you're going to automate PDF, you're going to automate email. So you are going to initialization means you're going to open, you're going to launch. That is things called initialization. Again, read configuration file and initialize application means there is some file you're going to read, and initialize application used in process means it's saying that whatever the particular process you're going to automate, that you're going to read the config file and initialize the application used in process. Means whatever the process you're going to automate, you have to initialize. So these particular things we are going to understand. Read config file, read configuration file. What is config file? You have to understand right now. That is the main important part, and that things I have discussed here. What is the config file in ReframeWork? That things you are going to understand here. Let me come here. When you create any particular project in UiPath, if you're going to create any particular project, let me come to normal way also. If you create any program, there is one thing called File Explorer. File Explorer means directly you can go on your system. You can click on this things called File Explorer, and directly you can go to your system like this way. Okay, we are coming to this page. Okay, so it's showing that documents, UiPath, Fab data, and we are getting the particular thing. So the same thing, if you come to ReframeWork, there is a things called project. We are getting this things called File Explorer, and if you click on this things called File Explorer, so you can go inside this things called system. We can go right now in system, and right now we are getting here that is things called data. So data, you have to click on this things called data, and right now we're getting this things called one config file. In every particular project, in any project, if you create the ReframeWork program, automatically you will get this things called config file, and that things you're going to understand. Again, the question right now is what is config file? Config file is same one Excel sheet. Config file is nothing but one Excel sheet, normal Excel sheet, and UiPath has already inbuilt this Excel sheet. Whenever you create the particular framework, automatically that Excel sheet you will get inbuilt into that system, and automatically whenever you create, automatically in this particular project in data, we'll get one Excel sheet that name is config file. Let me open this config file. Okay, so the next question right now is how it's going to help that config file. Please understand this question. Please understand this thing is called config file. Config file, how is going to help? Okay, I will tell right now. Suppose that you're going to automate any website, and website like that we are going for this things called URL. You know that URL, there is a testing URL, there is a prod URL, means prod means production URL. So there are a number of URL is there. You're going to download some data, you're going to display some data. So maybe that something is going to change. Something means suppose that your queue name is going to change, your asset name is going to change, your URL is going to change, something is going to change. So one time we have developed the one project and we have deployed the project to the client system. So every time your development is not going to till 100 years, every time it's not going to possible to go for these things called development and all these things. In that case, what we can go here right now, like that my URL is going to change. Today my URL is www.google.co.in. Okay, we are getting these things called google.com. Okay, tomorrow like the client say that tomorrow I don't want to go for these things called Google, I want to go for these things called Facebook. Okay, I want to go for these things called Facebook. So right now what I told, don't go for these things called UiPath for your coding part and all these things. Try to come here and only I'll try to go here and I'll try to change these things called Google to, we can pass these things called HTTPS, and here instead of passing these things called Google, we can pass here that is things called Facebook. Means we can pass the dynamic data, everything will be same like that your all this part is this things called coding part, that is things called name, but tomorrow if client want to change these things called particular things called like that URL, like that here we can pass this things called. Okay, so there what we can go for that, we can cut here and we can paste here. Okay, so right now directly we can change the Facebook. Okay, so we have developed one project, and if client is going to change the Facebook directory path, URL, asset name, queue name, whatever the client want to change, and that data should be dynamic. Dynamic means right now I want to change these things called directly I can pass here. Okay, but internal part will be same, means that is things called, that is the things done by only developer. This part is developer, that part is this things called value can change anytime. Suppose that we have a path. Okay, so right now I pass this things called path. Tomorrow you're going to download one any data, and my path is this things called C and your testing. Okay, tomorrow I'm going to deploy on any project and you're going to download the data. So there you can come here and you can pass your system path. Okay, so my program is same, but whatever the data you want to pass here, you can change all these things. Suppose that my asset name is A. Okay, my asset like that that is things called my asset name is A. Today I pass these things called asset name, that is things called asset name. Okay, that is things called asset name. Tomorrow you want to change to asset name to A, B, C, whatever you want to go for that. Okay, so that I can pass here whatever I want, means whatever the particular things like the asset name, your queue name, your URL name, your directory name, whatever these things, it's going to change after 3 years, after 1 month, after 3 months, after 3 years. That things that client can change the data, so that things it's directly client can change it. This particular data is on already internally connected to these things called RE framework. That things you have to understand here, and each and every data we can pass it. Okay, and this is the things called coding part, that is things called fix, and that is fixed done by developers, any technical person. So they can fix these things called URL, they can pass these things called asset, they can pass these things called queue, they can pass these things called path, they can pass. Okay, so that is these things called, they can fix this part, and here I pass these things, queue is AB, your path is these things called C test, whatever you want to go for that. So right now that is things called after 1 month, after 1 day I want to change, means I want to, means client want to change these things, directly he can come here and directly he can pass the data whatever he want. Okay, so that things why we have done, because after development, after 4 years, after 5 years, every time we cannot go for development. If any project come to any particular company and across world, that is the time like 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. Okay, after that till life we cannot go for these things called maintenance and all these things. Till life, what we go for that, we can help this client like that. If you want to change something, you can come here and you can pass the data into the config file. So that is the things called, guys, config file, and that particular provide with these things called UiPath RE framework, and every particular project you will get the automatically you can get. Okay, so that is things called RE framework. And whenever you have already provided the data, always try to close the particular sheet, particular Excel sheet, and that we are going for this things called save. Okay, so already we have saved here, and let me come to this things called RE framework. Okay, so right now we're going for this things called read configuration file. Read means whatever the data you want to change, there you can go for this things called change data. And initialize application using process means you can go for launch. You can go for launch. Okay, so right now what it's trying to go for this things called initialization. It's saying that whatever the program right now, try to give this things called demo. Suppose that I'm going for this things called BP table, this particular website. Okay, so the first part right now is what we are going to do. We are going to pass like this way. We are going to pass right now like this way. We'll try to go for this things called project. We are going for this things called data. We are going for this things called config file. And here I'm going to pass this things called URL. And here I can pass this things called BP table. Okay, whatever the asset you're going to use, suppose you're going to asset use 4 times G. You're going to pass this thing called 4 times G. The Q name is 4 times H. We are going to pass here. So that things we can pass here. Okay, if you want to display the data, hello. Okay, so that type things we can pass here, like that your URL name, your asset name, and Q name. Okay, so right now we are going to launch this particular website, bptableblueprint.com. Asset part right now, whatever the asset name, you can come to this particular server. That is this things called server. You will come here, and here you will come to this particular place. You can click on this things called, that is the particular server. You can go there and try to go for create the particular what I can say. Okay, so there you can go for this things called queue and asset part. You can create your particular things. You can go there and you can create these things called asset. Whatever the asset name you create here, like this, suppose you're going to create these things called whatever. So whatever the asset name you're going to create, the same asset we are going to mention in this particular place, like that, whatever the asset, 4 times G or whatever. So tomorrow you're going to change the asset name. So directly you will come here, you change the asset name, and here the same thing we are going to pass here. So every time, every day we can pass here the same asset name and all these things. Okay, so right now we are going to launch this particular website. So what the things right now, we are going to automate this particular website. So this particular ID password we are going to store into this particular website, and this particular asset name that it's coming through this things called config file. We are getting this things called config file, and we are going to automate right now. Okay, so the first part of this things called RE framework, that is especially for launching this things called particular website, taking the particular ID password from this things called asset, that is from asset, but asset name that I'm passing through this things called config file, and your ID password will store on this particular place, that is thing called credential, and there I can pass this things called admin, and we are going for this things called password, whatever the password you're going to pass. So like this way we can pass the password and you can go for right now. Okay. So this particular initialization, that is especially for reading the config file and launching these things. Okay, so according to this file, we are going to launch the website. According to this things called asset name, we are going to pass the ID password. We are going for this things called passing these things called ID password into this particular place. And right now we are going for click on login. Okay, and one thing so also I'll try to tell you right now, that is things called, already we use this things called Q part. So this using this name particular things called Q name, we are going to upload the data on this things called Q part of orchestrator, that is things called, we are going for this things called Q part. We are going for this things called Q part, and there we are going to upload the particular things. We are going for these things called we are going to upload this data into this particular queue. The same thing, we are going to create the add queue. We are going for this things called create a new queue, and whatever the name, suppose your name is AAA, the same queue we are going to pass into this particular place here, like that in queue name, and that things we are going to upload into queue. Okay, so in this particular website, I'm going to automate. So the first part, we are going to launch this website using this config file. We are going to pass this things called ID password using this things called asset part. We are going to for automate, we want Excel sheet. That Excel sheet also I'll try to share here. So that particular Excel sheet we are going to upload on this things called queue. That is the one Excel sheet. So first, the part for initialization, we are going to upload this type of data on this things called queue part, and that things we are going to automate here. So this particular, the first part is this things called initialization. That is for launching this data, launching this website, and use the config file and using these things called asset and queue part, whatever you want to automate. That is things called initialization. If everything is fine, maybe you are not able to automate, you're able to automate. Okay, so if you're not able to automate, we will go for system exception, and in end process, the try catch block, your exception handling, each and everything is available. You can go there and you can go for this things called closing this application. There you can go for this things called close the application. So that is the things called main part, guys, initialization. If everything is system exception come, it's right now it will go for this thing called end process. If everything is fine, like if there is no any system exception, if you are able to work on these things called initialization, it will come right now for these things called get transaction data. Get transaction data, you have to understand these things. Get the next transaction to be processed. You know that what is transaction? Transaction means right now I'm talking about these things called queue part. Whatever the data you going to upload on these things called queue part. Suppose that, let me come here, let me show these things. If you're going for these things called queue, so let me open any queue. Okay, so my data new, let me go for this things called open queue. If you're going for this things called view transaction, there is no data. Let me go for any queue. Okay, so we are getting these things called new. Okay, and if you go for these things called new, we are getting these things called view details, and right now I'm getting these things called empty. If you come here, you will get that type of some data. That is things called transaction. Means whatever the data you upload on queue, that is things called transaction. That things we are getting these things called transaction, and here we'll get on the particular place, and that part you have to upload. Okay, so the same thing we are discussing. Let me show any type of data, so you're able to understand here. Okay, right now not saying, but I'll tell you right now. Here, let me go for H. Okay, so if you come here right now, we are getting this things called new, and right now I'm getting this things called Rajesh testing Delhi. So that type of data I'm getting here, that is things called name, dates, and city. Okay, so right now, ReframeWork what try to say right now, whatever the particular data, I'm talking about this things called data. So first things we try to upload that on queue, that like that person, that is Sydney Nazario, email, whatever. Okay, so whatever the data, you're going to store this type of data on queue, and after that you are going to take this data from queue. That is things called get the next transaction to be processed. Means right now the work of this things called get transaction data, that is especially for extracting the data from queue. Means what I'm trying to say right now is whatever the data I've already uploaded on this particular server, that data we are going to extract from that particular website. We are going to extract the data from this things called queue part, and that things we are going to do right now. That is the get transaction data. If there is some data, means if you are getting this data in previous part, lots of things called no data available, there is no, like that data was not available. So right now, if the data is available, right now what we are going to say right now, if the data is available, we are going for this thing is called new transaction. If there is no data, means if there is no data in the queue, you've already taken the data, it will go for this things called end process, that is things called end state, that is things called end process, and close all the application whatever you used. Okay. So right now that is things called get transaction data, and get transaction data especially for extracting the data from the queue. Means the work right now is whatever the data available on the particular server, that data we are going to extract. If you're talking about this thing called process part, here the first part, that is things called, here I'll explain all these things on this particular framework. So initialization especially for launching this website and going for login and uploading the data queue. That is the first part. The second part, if you are going to second part, it will try to come here and it will try to extract one by one all data. That is the work of these things called get transaction, guys. If there is a get transaction data, if there is a data is able, it will go for these things called process transaction. Means right now, so whatever the data it's getting from this things called particular website, that is from server, it will try to extract all the data from here, and it will try to go for these things called proceed into this particular server. So right now the process part, let me go on these things called process. In the process transaction, right now what we are going to do, we are going for next further work, and we are going to take these things called attached browser. We are going for this things, so click on create code, and whatever the data we are getting from this things called particular server, from this things called queue part, that data we are going to pass here. So that's why its name is called process. Its name is called processing your data, and that process things we are going to process into this part. So right now the project is divided into three parts. One is especially for launching this website, uploading data queue, and go for login. That is the first part. The second part, extracting the data from queue, and third part is this things called clicking on this things called create code and passing your all the data, whatever the data I'm going to extract from this particular server from the queue part, and we are going to provide the data into this particular website, and we are going for this things called click on create code. Okay, so that things they have splitted the part in these things called RFM, because if you're going for any project, maybe there are n number of system exception, there are n number of business exception will come. So that's why we are going for these things called this type of RFM. If you're getting these things called data, so there you can go for these things called like that. You're getting these things called success. So one by one the data will come. One by one means what? Right now in the queue we are getting these things called multiple queue, like the two data. So two data we are going to extract. Maybe in Excel sheet 4 row is there, one row, second row, third row, fourth row. So one by one we are getting this all the data, and we are going to pass here. So one by one it's going for this things called success, like that we are going for this things called success. Okay, so we are getting these things called, if the data is coming one by one, we are going for a success. So again I'll try to go for loop, and again I'll try to go for these things called take the data. If there is data available, we'll go for these things called success. If there is no data, again it will go for these things called system exception, and that will be in loop in proper order. There you can go for these things called system exception, and if there is any business exception, it will go for these things called get transaction data. You know that what is business exception? Business exception means the data is not available on that particular place. Means suppose that you're going to pass any type of Excel sheet, if you're going to pass any directory, if the data is not available, if the data is not going to match, that is called business exception. That is things called business. Okay, so right now what it's trying to say, if there is a no data, it will go for end process. If there is a no transaction, it will go for if there is a new, sorry, if there is this things called new transaction, it will go for this things called process transaction, and it will try to go for this things called automate this particular website, that is things called BP travel. Okay, so so that things guys, that is things called guys RFM. And if you go for any interview across world, people are going to understand these things called process. People are going to understand these things called components. People are going to understand these things called config file, and how it's going to work the config file, your all this activity, your all the state machine part, your activity like the state part, this state part, this state part, that is the 3 states and 1 final state. Okay, so state machine sorry, RE framework is totally, it's called robotic enterprise framework, and that is entirely is one template, and that is totally depend on state machine. If you want to go for understand the RE framework, you have to understand these things called state machine. We are getting these things called three states, that is things called initialization, get, transaction, process, and the last part is this thing called end process, that is things called final state. So that things you have to understand this lesson, especially for launching this website, launching this your application, and taking data from your config file. You have to read these things called config file. Get transaction data especially for extracting data from your queue item, and process especially for whatever data you're going to extract from this particular server, that it's going to process this type of data. It's going to process this particular data, mean it will extract from this data, and right now we are going for processing into this particular place. Okay, so that is things, guys. You have to understand the particular concept of these things called RE framework. RE framework is very simple, and everything they've already provided, that is already inbuilt function, that things you have to use, and this particular structure you don't have to touch. Everything it's already attached. Whatever the things you want to start. Suppose that what you're going to ask, this things called end process. Okay, end process means in end process, if you go for this thing called end process, everything exception handling also they provided. Exception handling means there is things called close all application, open workflow. There is nothing. If you want to automate, if you want to close any particular browser, you can take here this things called attach browser. Which browser you want to close? Whatever the browser you want to close, definitely will come here, and you can go for right now is you're going to attach your current screen. So we can go for this things called indicate on screen like this way, and we can go for this things called close tab. Okay, so we can go for this things called close, nothing else. Okay, so everything is totally empty. Everything is totally empty. You can see right now the close all application, that is already in try catch block, that is already in exception handling, that is already the UiPath has done all this part. Okay, so this particular activity, that its name is close all application, that is the one particular, you know, that is things called one sequence, and that particular things called attach browser, they've kept inside these things called end process. End process is your final state, and if you go for this things called end process, we are getting this things called one open workflow. Open workflow, if you click there, you will get this things called close all application, and there I've kept this thing called attach browser, means automatically it's going to close your project. Means all the template is totally blank. Whatever the process you're going to automate, that process, the data, your application path, your asset name, your queue name, your directory name, your end process, everything you have to pass, and according to that you have to manage all these things, and you can automate. Okay, the next question right now is, can we go for any program, whatever you want to go for, that can we start with ReframeWork? No, guys, I will not recommend to go for these things called ReframeWork. Suppose you want to automate this thing called Notepad, and you want to go for these things called ReframeWork. No. Okay, I say no. Again, the next question right now is, anyone is going to ask these things, can we display, can we automate any simple message box using these things called RE framework? Yes, we can go for, we can display any particular things using these things called RE framework. Let me show these things. So that name is called init all application. You have to go for Control F, and whatever the things you want to display, you can go for these things called, and we can go for display. We can pass the message box, and right now we can pass here like that, hello everyone. Okay, so let me understand these things, what you have to go for that. If you're going to ask the question, can we display any message box? Can we do any type of program? Yes, any type of program, even small program, or like that on top level, any complicated program, you can go for using these things called ReframeWork. If anyone is going to ask how to display the message box in ReframeWork, you have to say that you have to open these things called init all application. You can go for control and F, and you can search these things called init all application. You have to go for init all application, and you have to pass these things called message box. Hello everyone, we are learning ReframeWork, and all this program you have to run using these things called save, and you're going for this things called run file. You're going to click, but if after going to click, you have to close this particular config file. Config file, whenever you're going to run this particular program, please make sure you've already closed these things called RE framework config file, because config file they've used these things called retrange, that is the workbook activity, and if you're going to use these things called workbook activity, it will display the error. That's why we are going to close this particular config file. So before going to start the program, try to close your config file. Okay, so we are getting these things called hello everyone, we are learning ReframeWork program. That is the first part. The second part I'll try to tell you right now is hello everyone, and that program, that data directly I'm not getting, the data I'm getting through these things called config file, and that data I've written in this things called config file, and that is I'll try to show right now. The last I was getting these things called hello everyone. You can see right now. Let me come here. I'll try to tell you right now. Here, the first part I was getting hello everyone, we're learning ReframeWork. The second part I was getting these things called hello everyone, and hello everyone here I've written the data I've written in this things called config file, and that things I'll try to tell you right now. That is, we are getting here the data. It's very simple. We're going for this things called data. We are going for this things called config file, and there I have written this things called data. The name is this things called column, that is things called data, and data we are not going to touch. Data is things for especially for developers, and this part is especially for your client. Hello everyone, we are learning config file RE framework. Okay, so every time only to write this particular data, and after that you have to save the particular file. That's it. So the name is this things called data, and that is for especially for developers, and this particular things called data, that is inbuilt function of this things called config file, and this particular things we have mentioned is in this things called message box, and automatically we are getting this things called one argument, that is things called in config argument, and here I pass this thing called in config, and there I've used this things called data because we have used the same data into your config file. Again, I'll try to tell you right now. If you're going to pass any name means whatever you want to go for that. Here I pass these things called data. If I'm going to pass any name, I can take, right? I'm going to pass these things called UiPath. Very simple. Okay. Or I can say right now, say very simple, according to name, I can pass. I'm going to pass here data to display. Data to display. So that same part I'm going to copy, and I'm going to mention in this particular UiPath. We are going to pass right now is UiPath. Okay, we are going for this things called. Okay, whatever you want to go for this. Suppose you want to pass this type of things. Let me come in this. Suppose you want to display this particular things. Okay, so right now I'm going for this things called here. I'll try to paste here into this particular page, and here like this way, and this path I will display into this message box. We'll go here, and there I can take another activity, that is things called message box. And here I'll try to copy this part. We'll try to paste here. Here only I'll try to change this things called name. Whatever you want to display, automatically it will come here. That we have done. So right now we have passed this things called data display, and we have passed this things called path. So whatever the data I've written here, path or data display, automatically it will come, and you have to close the particular sheet before going to start data to display. It's fine. Let me go for that, and data to display. So always try to go for best practice, and always you have to run this particular program through main. And before going to start, if init all application is open or close, it's not an issue. You can go for close also, but always try to run the program using this things called main file. And before going to start this things called program, try to close your particular config file. Let me go for that. The first message box we have written here, hello everyone, we are learning ReframeWork program. That second message box, hello everyone, we are learning these things for config ReframeWork. That thing's also working. The last, see users PC documents ReframeWork February and data, that things also working, means my config file is working proper. That's why we are going for these things called dynamic program, dynamic data, and there we can go for use that type of task, that type of template, that is things called RE framework. For RE framework also, that is not like that we have to go for very depth level and understand these things called .NET, all these things. You have to understand the concept of these things called RE framework, how RE framework is going to work. You have to understand the concept, that what is the work of initialization, what is the work of get transaction, what is the work of process transaction, what is this things called end process, how we can go for that. That start is also movable, you can move anywhere, we can move anywhere. That is also we can go for enlarge, that is also we can go for enlarge. Okay, so that is the same thing, that is the part of state machine, and that is also we can do here. Okay, so that is you have to understand and you have to go here. Okay, that is the same things. If you're going for RFMG, control jet and proper, it will be on place. Okay, so you have to play with these things called RFMG. That is the one template, guys. So that's why I have written the data in proper one notepad data, that is things called RFMG. That things you have to understand, guys, and you have to go for create one program. Okay, so normal one program also I've done. I've given these things called step also, how you can create. Today also create these things called how to display the message box, all this program. The same concept you have to follow in these things called any web-based automation, your notepad automation. You can pass the particular path of your URL, you can pass the ID password, you can pass your notepad data, you can pass your directory path, whatever you want to pass, you can pass there, and you are able to automate. And always you can go for these things called main part, and you can, that is the today's my first part of these things called that is especially for introduction. And if you give the introduction of these type of things in any particular interview, 100% you will get the success from any interview. That is sufficient to give the demonstration about these things called RFM. And this particular program, if you're going to say 100%, you will get these things called job in market, especially for RFM. That is, it's going to help you. Thank you guys for watching this video. Thank you.